Good morning. I want to share with you this morning the spiritual discipline of honesty. Now, there is a spiritual discipline called truth-telling, which is very important, and that's about us being honest with one another. But this morning, we're going to talk about the spiritual discipline of honesty, and that's about being honest with ourselves, but most especially with God. And we're talking about being honest with God when it comes to our feelings, especially in the midst of this COVID-19 pandemic and in the midst of the tragic events that occurred this past weekend. The difficulties and tragedies of life cause an emotional response in us. What do we do with these feelings of shock, horror, dismay, anger, fear, sadness, empathy, uncertainty, confusion, and disgust, to name a few? Our habit may be to simply suppress these emotions and pretend that we don't feel anything. And somehow I fear that we have got the incorrect message over the years that it isn't okay to feel difficult emotions. On the other side of the hand, on the other hand, for that matter, sometimes when it comes to emotional responses, we allow them to overwhelm us and to take us into some deep emotional abyss where there is no hope and no end. If steam is not allowed to escape from a pressure cooker, it will explode and cause a great mess. Emotions that are not dealt with in a healthy way will eventually leak. And what do leaking emotions look like? Well, they look like outbursts of anger, sarcasm, defensiveness, frantic activity, busyness, bitterness, a critical spirit, gossip, the need to micromanage or control people's lives, to name a few. Part of the problem is that we feel uncomfortable and ill-equipped to handle pain and suffering. Our immediate response is, let's fix it, and let's make it better so it will go away as quickly as possible. But none of these scenarios is the biblical way of dealing with tragedy and pain. Much of the biblical story is found in the context of pain and suffering. Job lost everything in one day: his family, his livelihood, and his health. How did he respond? He honestly grieved before God. He cried out to God and he questioned God. He cursed the day he was born. He asked God to crush him and take his life. Job unleashed raw human emotion before God. David wrote many of the Psalms, and he poured out his honest feelings to God. For example, in Psalm 109, David honestly tells God how he feels, the hurt he feels because he has been being betrayed. He says about the person who has betrayed him, appoint someone evil to oppose him. Let him be found guilty. May his days be few. May his children be fatherless. May his wife be a widow. In other words, what David is saying, may he drop dead. And then he says, may he fail in all he does. And God, remember his sin and the sin of his parents. Now that's pretty strong language for someone who is supposed to be loving others, loving his neighbors as he loves himself. Yet David is simply telling God how he feels. He tells him how much it hurts. He says his heart is wounded within him. But after he gets it off his chest, he asks the Lord to help him and deliver him. He is being honest with God about how he feels. Then in faith, he leaves the situation with God and ends up praising the Lord. Did God smite David? Did he wipe him off the face of the earth for his feelings? Well, not at all. God called David a man after his own heart. Did God punish Job for his honesty about how he felt? No, quite the opposite, actually. He blessed Job. And this is the biblical pattern. Solomon in Ecclesiastes calls life meaningless, and Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, laments over the sin and punishment of Judah. Peter denies Jesus and weeps because of his actions. And we see Jesus weeping at the death of Lazarus and weeping over the sin of Jerusalem. And in great agony, he cries out to God in the Garden of Gethsemane. All of these people honestly dealt with their feelings before God. God through His Word, gives His people permission to deal honestly with their pain and what they are feeling, and to trust Him in the midst of it all. And He invites us to do the same. He doesn't give us permission to sin in our pain, in our deep feelings. That's why we go to God and tell Him how we are feeling, for it's a safe place to unload. And we may not even know what it is we are feeling, but that's okay too. We tell God and ask Him to show us these emotions that we are dealing with. A Christian counselor told the CBAC pastors last week that it's okay not to be okay. And I heard a sermon earlier this week with the same message, and it said it's okay not to be okay in difficult times because Jesus is okay. And I'm not talking about wallowing in our pain, but coming to God with our thoughts and feelings in hard times. He is big enough to handle anything we say or throw at Him. He knows what we're thinking, after all. He wants us to be honest with Him and say it in His presence. As we bring these emotions to God and into the light of His presence, healing begins its journey. It's okay to feel bad about what's going on. It's okay if you don't know what you're feeling or if you don't feel anything. Talk to God about that. But I encourage you this week to get quiet before the Lord and tell Him whatever it is you're struggling with. And in some cases, you may need to talk to someone else besides God, and that's okay too, and we'll hear more about that later in the service. So this week, talk to God, tell Him those deep feelings you are feeling, and bring it to Him.